Welcome to episode 3 of Think Through. Today I'm going to talk to Dr. Max Baker-Hytch, a philosopher at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University, who specialises in philosophy of religion and epistemology. Baker-Hytch has a forthcoming book on divine hiddenness and a popular paper on the evil god challenge. But today we're discussing his very recent work on near-death experiences and whether they provide evidence of an afterlife. In this episode we discuss near-death experiences with some examples, Substance Dualism and Idealism, plus paranormal perception, Bayesian reasoning, and of course, the afterlife. I hope you enjoy. So Max, thank you for joining me. I'm just going to kick straight in here. The paper we're going to be discussing today concerns near-death experiences, or what people call NDEs. I must admit that I'd heard of these before, but I didn't know that they were taken seriously academically. Are they? And what's the sort of status of these things?
Depends which academics, and yeah, I think your initial assessment probably was somewhat fair in that I would say, okay, in terms of neuroscientists, there definitely is interest in the phenomenon of NDEs from some neuroscientists, but I think overwhelmingly there's an assumption that what we need to do is just come up with a naturalistic explanation of these. So I don't think they would be taken seriously in the sense of being potentially evidence for some non-naturalistic phenomenon by neuroscientists in general. So yeah, I would say there's some interest in them from some philosophers of mind and philosophers of religion. And I think also, you know, there is now a journal of near-death studies which has been going for a few decades, and all of the people who kind of edit that journal are, you know, respected, credentialed people. They're generally a sort of mix of people in the medical profession, so cardiologists, and also psychologists. And maybe one or two philosophers. So yeah, I think there's sort of a little corner where they're taken seriously, and it's not sort of, it isn't kind of quackery. I mean, okay, I'm sure some skeptics think it is, but the people who do take them seriously, that, you know, that there is a significant body of work being done by, you know, very well credentialed academics.
Mm-hmm. So do you think the reason why people, some say disciplines or sets of people don't take it seriously, do you think that's sort of mere prejudice, or is there more sort of principled reasons for
it? Well, I do think, you know, so obviously I'm an outsider to the field of neuroscience, but I know people who work in that field, and certainly what they've told me is that there is a very strong sense that naturalism or physicalism, whatever term we want to use, is close to sort of being a kind of axiom of most people working in that field. So I think given that, it's natural that the way people are going to instinctively approach NDEs is how can we find a reductive explanation for this stuff?
Okay, so that's interesting. So in terms of the people then that do look at them as being data that need to be accounted for, how many of them are doing so with the intention of sort of reducing them to some naturalistic explanation, and how many of them are doing so because they find what they hold out as a sort of a refutation of physicalism to be interesting, do you think?
I'd be hard-pressed to sort of give any sense in terms of numbers or proportions, really, but I think there's a group of people who are making making a concerted effort to explain them away. And there's also a group of people who are quite, making a concerted case that they point to something beyond the physical. And so, yeah, there's two camps. I'd be hard pressed to say what proportion of the discussion they each occupy. One thing I think is interesting, though, is actually if you look at the sort of career paths of some of the most notable NDE researchers who are on the more sympathetic side. So let's say Bruce Grayson, who's at University of Virginia in the psychology department there. He's very eminent in his field. He got interested in near-death experiences with having no prior inclination to think there was an afterlife or anything like that. And it was because of a clinical experience in which one of his patients had cardiac arrest and was thankfully resuscitated. But then he had a conversation, this patient recounted to him a conversation that Bruce Grayson had had with her roommate in a totally different room, word for word accurately, and he was stunned, and that set him in train, fascinated with the phenomenon. And actually that's quite a common story. It's not you might think, these people sort of just have an axe to grind and it's confirmation bias, they just went looking for stuff to confirm sort of spiritual or supernatural ideas. But it seems to me not the case, at least with some of the people whose work I've looked at most closely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. Well, so what is it that drew you to start to investigate these sorts of things and their potential importance?
Well, so I specialise primarily in two fields of philosophy, so epistemology and philosophy of religion, and so I'm, already interested in questions to do with religious belief, the rationality or lack of, and I've begun over the last, 3 years or so to start getting more interested in a related field, which is philosophy of mind, which I know you're particularly interested in. And there's lots of sort of a priori arguments, if you like, around the nature of the mind-brain relationship, which I think are really interesting. But I guess, maybe we'll get into this more later, but I think I do have a sort of empiricist bent in some ways, that I quite like it when there's not just a priori arguments, there's also something empirical that you can sort of think about. And NDEs, on the face of it, seem like they could turn out to be empirical evidence for some claims about the mind-brain relation. Exactly what is kind of complicated. I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yes, yeah, we'll definitely start to look at what kind of evidence NDEs might provide for various views in philosophy of mind. But so that we get a bit of an idea as to the sorts of things that we're talking about here, can you sort of give a couple of anecdotes or sort of explanations of certain NDEs that you would say are sufficiently medically corroborated to take seriously? The kind of thing that would be like a paradigm, this shouldn't be ignored kind of example.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a couple of cases. And the thing about both of them is that they were attested to by the medical professionals who are on the scene. And I think the reason that's worth mentioning is just that they don't seem like the kind of people who have a vested interest in promoting sensational claims about the mind and the body and that kind of thing, especially, in a medical and natural sciences environment, which is pretty, I think it pretty overwhelmingly naturalistic. So I think that's just something to mention at the outset. But so I'll give you one case. So this is a case that was reported by a French anaesthetist called Jean-Jacques Charbonnier at a hospital in Toulouse in France. So basically, he operated on a woman under general anesthetic, and then when she woke up, she immediately described her operation to the surgeon, or the anaesthetist, to Jean-Jacques Charbonnier, as if she had been on the ceiling. The way she described it was the perspective she had on the room, and then she described moving into the adjacent operating theatre and she claims that she saw an operation going on, which was the amputation of a leg, and then the leg being placed into a yellow bag for disposal. And so Jean-Jacques Charbonnier, the anaesthetist, immediately went and checked. And yes, indeed, in the next door operating theatre, there had been an amputation going on, and they had, taken off the leg and put it in this yellow bag. Okay, another case comes from the director of an intensive care unit. This case is recounted in it's in a number of places, but the place I got it was a book by Dale Allison, who's a sort of very eminent biblical scholar and theologian who has a book on religious experience that came out in 2022. So anyway, in this case. So the gentleman who was in the ICU was called Howard, and he had a cardiac arrest. And so as soon as they've managed to resuscitate him and he comes around, he tells the medical staff that he had this experience of apparently floating out of his body, rising up through the ceiling, and then finding himself looking at a large room, in which all around the edge were smaller rooms with glass and beds on which there were people hooked up to IVs. But he said, but they didn't look like normal people. They almost looked like dolls or mannequins. And he also said in the middle of the room was a workstation with computers. And so this ICU director who recounts this, what happened. And what the patient told him, he said, at this point his jaw dropped, because in fact there was an ICU nurse training center on the floor above, where nurses were trained on medical mannequins who were hooked up to IVs, and in the middle was a workstation. But this was a sort of restricted area where certainly no patients are ever allowed to go. So yeah, those are two cases, but they're quite representative, and there are. In fact, there's a book which has sort of tried to catalogue as many cases. In particular, with this feature, it's called something like "The Self Does Not Die." It's by 3 Dutch NDE researchers, but their criterion for inclusion was that there has to be first-hand written testimony in the public domain from someone who was able to independently corroborate the details of the person's NDE.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. And you told me one also about a lady with a shoe. What was that one?
Yes, right. So this one was given by a nurse called Kathy Milne at Hartford Hospital in Connecticut. And so she had a patient who had cardiac arrest, was resuscitated successfully, and she reported once she was able to speak again to Kathy Milne, the nurse, that she had this experience of floating up out of her body, all the way up through several floors of the hospital, and then out onto the roof and looking up over the skyline of Hartford, and saw an object, and in it was a red shoe that she saw. And then the NDE kind of ended, I guess. And so, Kathy Milne asked, I think it was that a junior doctor, a resident, as they call him in the States, was also present, and he was very skeptical about this. He was sort of slightly mocking. But he then decided to go and get a janitor, a caretaker, to help him get onto the roof. And Kathy Milne saw him, and this junior doctor had actually recovered that red shoe from the roof.
Okay, yeah, I thought that's quite amazing. So obviously these are near-death experiences that don't involve any kind of encounter with a spiritual realm or anything else, but I suppose that's the way that they can be medically corroborated. Is that the idea? Yeah,
so they often would do. It's just that from a sort of investigative point of view, that's the bit that can be corroborated in principle, right? So yeah, there would be more to those accounts. Often, I mean, so NDEs do vary in that sometimes they seemingly involve an out-of-body experience, mostly of stuff going on in this world, if you like. Sometimes mainly sort of more otherworldly, and sometimes a mixture of both. But yeah, so in the way I told those cases, I focused just on the sort of arguably the most striking aspect from a kind of investigative point of view, which was the corroboration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, as you mentioned, there are people that look at these things to try and explain them in a reductive sense to a naturalistic worldview. What are the main kind of ways in which that would be done? How do the naturalists try to explain things like this?
Yeah, so I basically think it's helpful to divide the data to be explained into two categories, really. So first, there's just the sheer fact that there is conscious awareness when the brain is in a very impaired state, if not, just non-functional altogether. So yeah, there's that on the one hand, and then there's apparent veridical perception, apparent accurate perception of events really going on out there in the world that other people can corroborate. So as for the first piece of data, or the first category of data, if you like, there's all sorts of hypotheses that have been put forward to do with processes in the brain when it's deprived of oxygen. And in a sense, I kind of think, well, I'm certainly not qualified to weigh in on that, and I'm inclined almost just to grant that those explanations could get some purchase. Now, I mean, if there really are cases where the brain is completely, out of action for some time, and yet the person's having an experience, well, then then those sorts of explanations aren't going to work. But let's just suppose that we can't be really sure that the brain is completely out of action. So yeah, in that sense, I'm kind of inclined to just say, okay, yeah, maybe one of these hypotheses is right as to why there's able to be some kind of conscious awareness. So coming to the second category, which I think is the more interesting in some ways and the harder to explain, which is these aspects of the NDEs which seem to be accurately tracking events that are going on in the real world, sometimes in quite remote locations, like the rooftop several floors up and so on. So, I mean, the sort of favoured explanation I've seen in the writings of naturalists on this is what you could call sensory leakage. So the idea being that maybe it was because the doctors were talking about something, and the patient still had enough residual hearing to pick it up and build a sort of image in their mind subconsciously of what was going on, or because the events in question were actually going on in the room and they kind of could hear enough to build a picture of what's going on. So that's going to be one. I suppose coincidence is going to be another, although of course that's only going to work that's going to be a promising line of explanation only in proportion to, if you like, how probable that it is that those details would be accurate just by luck. Right, so the more improbable that it is that all of these details would be right just by luck, the harder it's going to be to explain it as just a coincidence. So I mean, I think that those really would be the main attempts at explaining. Other than I suppose, which I don't see too much in terms of the people who spend a lot of time from a skeptical perspective working on this stuff, which is to say, to question the sincerity of the people who are testifying about what's happened. I think there's strong reasons, and it might be there's one or two fabricated accounts. Certainly can't rule that out, but the idea that that's a good general explanation, I don't think is very plausible.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting, because I thought, when you're telling me those stories, I thought, well, there was nothing in principle about those that would mean that somebody might not have known that. For example, might not have known about the nursing testing floor, even the shoe on the roof. It may be that somebody had seen it out there, and it could be a sort of a joke. But you're saying that that's not really taken very seriously as a skeptical reply?
So I think, so maybe we could get into this a bit. It's certainly not that I would say those explanations are sort of impossible. It's all about probabilities when we're thinking about this stuff, I would say. And so particularly when you have lots of cases like this that are independent of each other, the way we would think about that in a sort of probabilistic framework is that you actually the strength of each piece of evidence, and there's a way to sort of think about this as being a kind of ratio, which is to say, how much more likely is it that we would have this data given a non-physicalist hypothesis compared with a physicalist hypothesis. And that ratio doesn't need to be all that big for it to be the case that if you have lots of cases where the ratio is in favor of the non-physicalist hypothesis, and they get multiplied together. So in the end, it's not going to be enough for the physicalist to just go along in each case and say, well, here's a possible explanation that's compatible with physicalism. It needs to be that the physicalist explanation makes it as likely or almost as likely as a non-physicalist explanation, if that's going to really do the job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so we'll get into that a little bit later in terms of the weight of NDEs as evidence for non-physicalist understandings of the mind. But just to give us an idea of where you talked about sort of the quantity ends up producing good reasons for us to take these things seriously, could you give us a rough idea of how many sort of NDE events are taken as being worth adding some sort of weight to taking them seriously? I mean, is it something that we're talking about hundreds a year, thousands a year? I mean, what are we at?
Yeah, I mean, so there are the largest study that was done on this was by a Dutch cardiologist called Pim van Lommel, and it was published in the Lancet, so a top medical journal. And basically, yeah, Pim van Lommel found that essentially, well, sorry, maybe I should start by saying how he conducted his study. So this was what's known as a prospective study. So he basically had 344 cardiac arrest survivors, and he didn't know before they engaged them in the study whether they'd had an NDE or not. So that's why it's called a prospective study. And that's to try and stop any kind of bias in terms of, if they already know whether they've had an NDE or not, that can skew the study in certain undesirable ways. Okay, so out of those 344 cardiac arrest survivors, 64 of them had some kind of NDE. Wow. That can range from some kind of very fleeting experience which doesn't have a whole lot of interesting content necessarily, through to something very vivid involving out-of-body experiences, perhaps experiences of apparent heavenly realms. So of those 64 who'd had some kind of NDE, 15 had some sort of out-of-body experience, and of those, one person had vivid experiences of this worldly events, if you like, that were able to be checked by the medical staff and were indeed found to be accurate. So I think, that might give you some sense of the incidence rates of these kinds of things.
Yes, if I remembered those numbers as you just said them, so that seemed about 20% of them had some kind of NDE.
Some kind of NDE.
5% had out-of-body experiences.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
5% of people who had a cardiac arrest and resuscitated had out-of-body experiences, 20% something. And then, just under a third or so?
Yeah, Worth mentioning another study by Sam Parnier called the AWARE study. So Sam Parnier, a very eminent cardiologist, he had 101 cardiac arrest survivors in his study, of whom 9 had an NDE, and of those 2 had out-of-body experiences. One of those was able to be corroborated in detail. So those are probably our largest 2 studies to date on the incidence rates.
That's a bit fewer, but still quite considerable, isn't it? So I guess a lot of this, especially if it's to do with cardiac arrest, as you mentioned, this must mean that we're starting to find out about this a lot more often as medical science improves, right?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, the phenomenon was one that wasn't really known about until, resuscitation became something that we could do medically in a lot of cases. So you do get the odd kind of report from antiquity of what sounds like an NDE and has some similar features. And I mean, in those cases, the person would have been very, very lucky to have somehow returned to life from, well, I mean, we can't really be sure, obviously, whether it was a cardiac arrest, but yeah, so I think the explosion of awareness of this phenomenon undoubtedly has to do with modern medical means for resuscitating people.
Okay, all right, fantastic. So let's say we take NDEs seriously then. What is it that you think, from a philosophical point of view, we can take this to show us?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it depends what we mean by show. We're pedantic philosophers, so I mean, I think what they can, what they should make us take seriously, is firstly, I think the thing that they should make us take the most seriously is that there may be some kind of capacity, albeit extremely dimly understood, for what I called in my paper veridical paranormal perception. So this, in and of itself, it doesn't actually imply any particular view on the mind-brain relationship, but what I mean by that phrase, veridical paranormal perception, is that there's some kind of perceptual mechanism. So it's a mechanism for actually tracking what's going on in the objective world. It's paranormal, which is to say it's not one of the ordinary 5 senses, and it's veridical. Like, it seems in some cases that it is actually accurately perceiving what's going on out there. So I think that's something that it I think should make us take quite seriously. Becomes the next thing that we might wonder about is, does it let us conclude something, or does it point to some particular conclusion about the mind-brain relationship? That's much more complex, I think, and I know it's something you're very interested in. So my paper does suggest that there are ways you could take this that might support substance dualism, but actually the way that I think is the most interesting sort of path to take is in terms of thinking through whether these might support some kind of non-naturalistic picture of reality, and in particular one that includes an afterlife, is one that doesn't require you to commit to substance dualism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So we'll look at ways in which we might see it as evidence for an afterlife without going through substance dualism. But for the sake of listeners, could you just say a little bit about what substance dualism is and why near-death experiences might sort of be evidence for it? Yeah,
sure. Yeah, so I think some people think of the classical exposition of substance dualism as being given by René Descartes, the French philosopher of the 17th century. And so basically the idea is that there are essentially two types of stuff, two types of substance. So there's Descartes calls it there's extended matter, there's extended stuff, that's physical matter that has the properties of shape, mass, etc. And then there's thinking stuff, mental stuff, and that is not extended in space. And that's and Descartes thinks that in terms of what I am a thinking substance. I'm an immaterial thinking substance, or if you like, a soul. Although I think that the word soul is tricky because it means lots of things to lots of people. But so basically that we have an immaterial part of us. And then we have bodies, and that those two, the immaterial mind or soul and the physical body, causally interact with one another, at least during normal life. And there's of course more specific versions of substance dualism, and what I call in the paper strong substance dualism is the view that the immaterial mind can exist apart from the physical body.
Mm-hmm. So you'd mentioned it as a thinking thing. Is it also a perceiving thing independently of the body?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, different versions of substance dualism are going to have different things to say about this. So Richard Swinburne, who's an Oxford philosopher and a defender of substance dualism, I think his view is that a soul needs to be connected to a body in order to have perceptual awareness. But certainly there would be other versions of substance dualism. And in a way, I think so for people who are attracted to NDEs because they think it points to some kind of afterlife and some kind of immaterial mind or soul, I think the picture that they would most commonly have in mind is that the soul, I'm just going to stick with that for now because it's easier. The soul can exist apart from the physical body. It does interact with it in normal life, but it can become detached from it. And moreover, it has its own, if you like, perceptual abilities. And so that if you're attracted to that picture, that's presumably how you would try and explain how it is that there can be these outer body apparent perceptions.
Okay, so I can see how if we're taking NDEs seriously, and especially the kind of perceptual knowledge they seem to grant those that had them, that would be a problem for a physicalist view of the mind, because the perspective of being up on the ceiling when your body's down below suggests that the angle of perception is not the same as it would be from the eyes of the body. But why do you think that that's evidence for what you're calling strong substance dualism in particular, and not maybe for other kinds of non-physical in the mind like idealism, or maybe some strange versions of panpsychism? I don't know if that would work on that.
It's a very fair question. So firstly, I definitely don't think it's incompatible with let's call it Berkeleyan idealism. So essentially the view that all things are actually mental substances in the final analysis, including the things that we don't ordinarily think of as being mental substances, like the ordinary objects in this room that I'm perceiving. So I think I certainly don't think that view is incompatible with taking NDEs seriously. I guess it's going to come down to how strongly a given hypothesis predicts that unified conscious experience and indeed sort of perceptual abilities would persist in the absence of a functioning brain. So, on panpsychism, now I appreciate there are different versions of that. The versions that I'm most familiar with, so David Chalmers and Philip Goff's kind of versions of panpsychism, they seem to want to say, as far as I can tell, that conscious awareness does require a functioning brain. But, I don't see why someone in principle couldn't develop a version of panpsychism on which there's some story to tell about why Although the sort of macro kind of big consciousness, if you like, that somehow arises in our heads, distinct from the sort of micro consciousnesses of atoms and electrons and so on. If there's some story the panpsychist can tell about why our sort of big consciousness is temporarily associated with a functioning brain but doesn't have to be, then it seems like that could be quite compatible with taking NDEs very seriously.
Okay, all right, so I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, but I suppose if you were allowing that we don't necessarily know that the brain is non-functioning in such cases, there could be a way to have maybe a panpsychist view where there's sort of action at a distance.
Okay.
Where...
Yeah. So yeah, that's fair, and that then starts to resemble quite closely a hypothesis which I do mention a bit in the paper, which is sometimes called the super psi hypothesis. So Michael Sudduth is a philosopher who defends this. So basically, the idea is that we have psychic abilities. And that includes extrasensory perception, ability to do remote viewing, precognition, this kind of thing. And Sudduth would cite quite rigorous experimental research that's been done, like Gansfield experiments, for example, where waking subjects, this is not people under cardiac arrest, but waking subjects are able to sort of visualize an object that's spatially remote from them and that they've been screened off from in terms of ordinary senses, with a hit rate that's much higher than chance, that kind of thing. So yeah, he would want to say that somehow during near-death situations, sometimes a dormant or latent kind of capacity for ESP and for remote viewing is activated, and that's what's going on in NDEs. Okay, all right. So it sounds to me then as though NDEs make physicalism or versions of dualism which tie perceptual experience to a normally functioning brain from a perspective of our eyes are the ones that are ruled out, more than particularly evidence for a particular kind of substance dualism. Is that right? Because I certainly sort of thought that the kinds of idealisms I'm familiar with, I don't think that NDEs would be particularly odd in that sort of metaphysical view. And it'd be interesting to see if that would affect the argument going forward. But as you say, your preferred view is actually not to go via a particular theory of the mind, but to just go through the veridical personal perceptions. But before we do go there, I mean, and again, we don't need to spend too long on it. I realise it wasn't the thrust of your paper, but since you did sort of single out what you call strong substance dualism as the path for this sort of evidence, what about sort of the evidence that would weigh against strong substance dualism, such as the interaction problem, the union problem, and things like that? I mean, do you have a view on such things? Yeah, I do. I mean, so my view in general on philosophy of mind is that I don't think physicalism is very promising, but that leaves a lot of other things on the table still. And yet, so I do, I do have some kind of sort of soft spot for substance dualism, but I'm certainly not kind of strongly wedded to it. But I think, so substance dualism is famously charged with having this big problem in terms of like, well, how is it that these two radically different types of stuff causally interact with each other? And this was, put to Descartes by Elizabeth of Bohemia in a famous correspondence. I guess what I'm inclined to say about that is that if we had a really satisfying sort of account or analysis of causation, and we could see that account ruled out mental substances causing physical events in physical substances, then that would be a problem. But I don't it just doesn't seem to me that we do have such a satisfying account, or at least there's no consensus on one. So, you know, just to give a couple of examples. So, you know, David Lewis is very influential metaphysician, philosopher of mind, etc. of the 20th century, gave a counterfactual account, which roughly, although it has a lot more nuance, says that if for X to cause Y is for it to be the case that if X hadn't happened, then Y wouldn't have happened. Well, okay, suppose we run with that. As far as I can see, there's nothing about the structure of that account that precludes mental to physical causation. Or, you know, something that seems to be more popular these days is just to say that causation is just a primitive relation. There is no analysis to be given of it. And again, that doesn't seem to rule out mental to physical causation. So if there is a problem, I would suggest that it's more in terms of what an assumption that I don't subscribe to, that many philosophers do, called the causal closure of the physical. The idea that the universe is, albeit very large, but fundamentally, you know, closed system of physical cause and effect. But yeah, I guess I'm just inclined to see that really as a sort of article of physicalist faith more than something that's been established. And indeed, you know, it's hard to see how such a bold claim could have really strong evidence for it. It would have to be some kind of inductive inference that wouldn't look all that strong if you kind of tried to write it down on paper.
I couldn't agree with you more. I've never found the interaction problem to be very convincing at all. And not only that, it flies in the face of our everyday experience of doing things.
Yeah.
From a mental source. And so, yeah, I think, I've always scratched my head at that. And then you've also got the Humean idea of causation, which is that you don't need to take it.
Yeah.
It can just be a case of regular coincidence.
Yeah.
You see the regular coincidence all the time. So, yeah, okay, I'm with you on that. And as for other problems with substance dualism, you don't think there's anything else? What do you think is the best potential issue?
I mean, I think the one that I don't think it sort of ultimately has a huge amount of force for me, but the parsimony worry, like in general, we should try to not posit more things than we need to, and if you can get by without positing an immaterial substance, then you should. So yeah, but that's obviously going to depend very much on whether there are considerations that make us think we need to posit this thing, and that's obviously a source of controversy.
Well, I have a solution for you, Max, and you know what it is.
Idealism.
Be an idealist, exactly.
I have nothing against idealism.
One you don't need to posit is the brain or the body. Yeah, you keep the mind, you distress.
Yeah.
That's not the subject today. Maybe I'll pull a usual thing of an online person saying, "I'll convert you someday." Just okay, all right. So that's great. So there's one way to go through substance dualism, but that's not your preferred option. But it sounds as though the independent difficulties of substance dualism are probably shouldn't put you off considering that. But as you say, that's not what you think is the best. So how is the other way in which we might move? Well, we haven't actually yet talked about how substance dualism might relate to an afterlife, so we'll put that on pause actually. But the other way is to not go through substance dualism, but go through this, what you've called veridical paranormal perception.
Yeah.
So why would NDEs provide evidence for that? I mean, it seems quite obvious, but can you spell it out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if I could sort of maybe just sketch the framework that I use in the paper, which is a Bayesian one. So basically, Bayes' theorem is a widely employed framework for thinking about probabilistic reasoning, and a lot of contemporary epistemologists use Bayes' theorem, and so it's really a very simple idea at its heart, which is that the extent to which some evidence confirms a hypothesis is a matter of how much more likely it is that we would have this evidence given the truth of this hypothesis compared with given the falsehood of the hypothesis. So, for example, all right, if we've got a murder weapon and Jones's fingerprints are on the murder weapon, that looks like quite strong evidence that Jones is the murderer because, okay, the hypothesis that he's the murderer predicts quite strongly, makes it quite likely that his fingerprints would be on the murder weapon. Doesn't make it 100% because he might have taken measures to not do that, but it's like, you know, maybe 50-50. Whereas the hypothesis that Jones is not the murderer, it doesn't make it impossible that his fingerprints are on the murder weapon, but it's a lot less likely. How would his fingerprints have ended up on there if it wasn't him? Well, it looks like it's going to be quite a convoluted process that would have led to that, involving someone somehow faking his fingerprints and putting them on the gun and so on. So all that to say, yeah, the fingerprints on the murder weapon are quite strong evidence that he's the murderer, and it's because of that ratio, how much more likely this evidence is on the hypothesis Jones is the murderer compared with the hypothesis he's not. So, and that ratio is really key. So I said earlier that it's not going to be enough for any given case of an NDE where there's corroboration. It's not going to be enough just to say, well, it's possible, which say, for all we know, it could be that the surgeons were chatting about the IV, the nurse training center while they were resuscitating the guy. Yes, I agree that is possible, but it seems that, that's quite unlikely on the hypothesis that there's nothing but physical stuff going on. It seems pretty unlikely that while they're resuscitating a guy and they're really stressed, they're chatting about this restricted area upstairs where nurses get trained. Whereas the hypothesis of there being some kind of veridical perceptual mechanism that is what is producing these accurate perceptions of events going on in the world, that makes it quite likely that there would be these cases where people have these experiences that are able to be independently corroborated. So, and here's the key point. So if you have lots of independent cases where you have these features, that ratio, what's called the Bayes factor, or the likelihoods ratio, between how likely is this bit of data given hypothesis A versus how likely is it given hypothesis B. If that ratio it even just favors hypothesis A a bit across all of these different cases, the way that that's actually sort of modeled mathematically is that you multiply the ratios together. So the total evidence can be really powerful, even if in each case it's not that much more probable that you'd have the data on the non-physicalist hypothesis than on the physicalist one, which is why I think it's really important to stress that point, that it isn't enough for the physicalist to come up with some merely possible way that this could have happened. It's got to be that it's almost as probable that you'd get this data with just physical stuff going on. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to confirm for the listeners, I mean, Bayes' theorem and the formula is a rigorous mathematical formalization for evaluating the weight of evidence for any given hypothesis using decision theory. It's used in science. It's used all over the place. So it's very normal to do that. And so the idea is sort of switch it the other way around. So instead of asking, does this sort of mean that we have to deduce a certain metaphysics? Right. Of course you don't. It's instead sort of turning it around the other way around, saying, well, if we, based on this metaphysics, how likely would we expect that? And I suppose I found it interesting that you were doing that in your paper, because I'm as an analytic philosopher, surprisingly, we don't come across Bayes' theorem employed for these sorts of arguments very often. Most of the time, an argument is put forward in deductive form, and then somebody picks some kind of hole. And, well, we don't have to accept premise 2 because it's possible that it's false. And you were kind of pushing things the other way, admitting that it's possible that the NDEs could be the case, but sort of arguing that that a sort of a neutral point of view would at least see it as evidence for the view. Is that right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is. So the use of Bayes' theorem is a relatively recent innovation in analytic philosophy, and it's also only in some branches of analytic philosophy. So in metaphysics, in debates about whether there are abstract objects or whether there's such a thing as an objective present moment, all those kinds of debates, you basically will never see Bayes' theorem being used. And as you said, what you'll see is people putting forward deductive arguments, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, etc., and then people will kind of pick away at the premises. Why is that? I mean, my view on this is that Bayes' theorem is a particularly appropriate tool to use when the data that we are bringing onto the table is contingent and empirical in nature. I think it's the best framework we have for thinking about how to probabilistically reason about empirical facts and their evidential import. The reason I think you won't, and so that's why I think particularly in philosophy of religion, it gets used a lot when thinking about fine-tuning, and about stuff to do with like miracle reports, religious experience, that type of thing, because those are like contingent empirical facts, right? And we're trying to think about whether they have evidential import. So that makes sense. And and also in epistemology, when people are thinking about kind of the way of testimony, that sort of stuff, it gets used a lot. But when we're trying to reason from necessary truths which we think we know just a priori, not contingent empirical stuff, I don't think Bayes' theorem works well for that. And that's why I think you don't see it used much at all in wide swathes of philosophy.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that because the sort of traditional view is that metaphysical truths are necessary truths, whether we know it or not. I think if you come at it from an epistemological point of view, you might say that if you adopt a degrees of belief understanding, then you could say whether or not. I presume you could say whether or not substance dualism is true is going to be necessary, or rather contingent, but that the evidence of how you might know or adjudicate could
exactly.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. So the thing I'd want to distinguish is often the conclusions that people are gunning for or trying to establish in philosophy are necessary. I mean, actually, mostly I would say they're necessary. If they're true, they're necessary truths. But it seems like there are some cases where you could adduce contingent empirical evidence for necessary truths. Like in debates about the problem of evil, people do try to do that. They adduce certain empirical evidence, certain cases which is claimed are gratuitous evils, like evils that there couldn't be any outweighing good that would justify them. And so that it would be the occurrence of such events would be contingent, and we know about them empirically, but they are being used to try and establish a necessary truth, namely that there's no God. And I think you could, in principle, do the same in philosophy of mind. Now, where I think Bayes' theorem doesn't work well is that where you're reasoning from necessary truths. So if we, and this is this is going to be the case a lot in metaphysics. You start with some principle that you take your interlocutor to agree with, and then you're moving from that to try and establish something else, also a necessary truth. But because you started with a necessary truth that you think you know a priori, that's why I think Bayes' theorem won't work well for that type of thing.
Yeah, it sounds like you're making the very fact that we are talking about potentially empirical evidence for metaphysical positions is not very verificationist of us, is it?
It's not. No.
But I think that's quite interesting. Again, don't want to get too off topic, but I suppose anyone who watches this channel knows I'm a fan of F.H. Bradley, who thinks if your truth is degree theoretic as well as belief, I guess that might not
right. That's interesting.
You know, if your understanding of metaphysics is always going to be true to a degree, your metaphysical positions, that maybe isn't so surprising. So maybe we'll see more of that going forward, if you and I have anything to do about it. Anyway, okay, great. So so you deploy Bayes' theorem. So your approach is to say, given NDEs as empirical data, that if substance dualism were true, then that would make NDEs more likely than if physicalism, which is your sort of bogeyman, were true. So we've got now to having NDEs giving evidence for strong substance dualism and for veridical paranormal perception, but we haven't yet talked about afterlife. So where's the step from strong substance dualism and VPP, as you call it, to an afterlife?
Yeah, that's good. So I think there's a few different paths one could take at this point. So the one that I find the most interesting and compelling is one that goes from veridical paranormal perception and tries to establish an afterlife without going via substance dualism. But I also do talk about a couple of other ways you might try and get there that do involve substance dualism. So one is to say that, cases where there's, where it seems likely there was no there was no brain activity, but there was conscious awareness, lends support to substance dualism, which in turn lends support to an afterlife. And then another approach which says that veridical paranormal perception is best explained by substance dualism being true, and then trying to move from substance dualism to an afterlife. So, because I guess we've talked about some of the earlier bits of those, I'll just talk a little bit about how one might try to move from substance dualism to an afterlife. Would that be good just to dwell on for a minute?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that'd be good, and then we can move
on. So why, you may well have jumped off the train long ago, but if you've come so far as to think that substance dualism should be taken seriously because of NDEs, why would you take a further step to taking an afterlife seriously? And it's basically a Bayesian thought here. So again, as you were saying, that the way that this works in a Bayesian framework is you've got hypothesis A and hypothesis B, and you're reasoning from how likely do each of these make the thing that the fact that we're sort of taking for granted, how likely do each of them make it, and whichever one makes it more likely is more strongly supported. So the thought is that a lot of the possible scenarios, maybe most of the possible scenarios in which an afterlife exists, if you think through, reincarnation, coming back as a ghost, going to a disembodied heaven, various possibilities which humans have entertained over the centuries, in which that we somehow carry on living after somehow carry on having a conscious existence after our deaths, involve an immaterial soul. Or you might want to call that into question, actually, but at least on the face of it, they do. So in other words, an afterlife makes substance dualism quite likely. I don't think it's the only way there could be an afterlife. And actually, again, maybe you're highlighting the way that I didn't necessarily kind of give enough or really any time to a sort of Berkeleyan idealist view, because I certainly think that would be quite compatible with an afterlife. But so on that, then if we flip to the other side, virtually all the possible scenarios in which there's no afterlife are ones where we don't have an immaterial soul. I think that's going to be less controversial. If there's no afterlife, there's almost no reason to think there would be an immaterial soul in any of those scenarios. And so, it looks then as though if substance dualism is true, it supports the hypothesis that there's an afterlife more strongly than the hypothesis that there isn't an afterlife.
Yeah, okay. So why it doesn't... I guess it's not so obvious to me that if I Well, actually, I just want to first of all clarify something. So, because it seems the natural inclination when you get to this point is to say, okay, if substance dualism is true, does that mean we should infer there is an afterlife? But actually, we need to think about it the other way around.
Right.
So that if there were an afterlife, would that make substance dualism more likely?
Yeah.
And if there were not an afterlife, would that make substance dualism more likely? Why would there not being an afterlife sort of suggest that substance dualism would be not? We would not expect substance dualism, because you might be a substance dualist because you think you need to account for being a thinking thing, but you might not think that to continue independently of your body. You might just think that, well, things like the rationality and things like that require there to be something independent of the physical, but that wouldn't necessarily get you an afterlife, would it?
Yeah, no, you're right. And so I do think there are ways substance dualism could be true where there's no afterlife. It's just that I think if you somehow think of the space of all conceptually possible worlds, and you think of all of the ones in which there's no afterlife, it seems like most of those are going to be naturalist worlds where naturalism is true, or a lot of them are anyway. And so, yeah, as long as there's a kind of an imbalance in that ratio, so that more of the worlds, more of the scenarios on which there is an afterlife are ones where we have immaterial souls, than in the scenarios where there's no afterlife. That's what would tip it slightly in favor of, that's what would it mean that substance dualism gives at least some support to an afterlife.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, personally, I think I wouldn't go the possible worlds route, because I think once you do that, how are you going to compare cardinalities of worlds with each other? It just seems like they're going to be possibly the same kind of infinite cardinality of possibilities.
Yeah, that was not the best. Yeah.
You could probably go with something to do with just pre-theoretic probabilities.
Yeah.
Thought where, given an afterlife, you assign some probabilities to. If there were no afterlife, what's the probability of substance dualism? You're going to give physicalism a non-zero probability for sure.
Yeah.
But if there were an afterlife, you'd probably have to give physicality 0, would you? Or would you see Christian resurrection as some kind of...
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Peter van Inwagen and Dean Zimmerman have tried to say that you could have bodily resurrection with full physicalism. And maybe I'm not sure if their accounts work. I mean, they might show that there is a kind of bare conceptual possibility there, but it doesn't seem like the most certainly it doesn't seem like the most obvious way for there to be an afterlife. Yeah.
Okay, so that's still interesting. I was interested to find out that the Bradleys and Idealists didn't believe in an afterlife,
right?
Because sort of intuitively as well, I always you sort of think of them as potentially swinging together, but that they aren't. And so I guess I'm just curious to know a little bit more about how the Bayesian reasoning would work on that, when there's very little sort of empirical evidence you can point to understand the probabilities involved between metaphysical views of the mind and the hypothesis of an afterlife.
I mean, and it may be that as I said earlier, Bayesian probability is a framework that works really well for some kinds of questions and not very well for others. And it might be that we're getting into areas where it doesn't work so well, where we're trying to think about, because asking the question, does substance dualism lend more support to one view of the mind versus another? But substance dualism it's not in an obvious sense kind of a piece of empirical data. It's something we might infer from empirical data. But as I said, I think Bayes' theorem works best when the data we're trying to infer things from is contingent empirical data.
Yeah, but in some ways this is potentially grist to your mill as far as your conclusion goes, because your argument is that the path via strong substance dualism is the weaker path towards evidence from afterlife than veridical paranormal perception. So let's move on to what you think is the strongest argument or evidential support for an afterlife, which is veridical paranormal perception. Why? How does that, which, you know, obviously the cases we're talking about is people seeing shoes on roofs and nursing stations, etc. How does that provide evidence for an afterlife?
Yeah, so roughly the thought is this. So in many of these cases, we've got reason to think that a portion of the person's experience is tracking objective reality. So that's to say, these cases where we've got independent corroboration, especially where the events that are corroborated were not ones that happened in the immediate vicinity of the patient. Right. So then I sort of bring in an epistemological principle, which I think is a generally very plausible principle. And I call it the veridical carryover principle. So basically the idea is that if we have a source of information and we're able to corroborate a portion of that source of information, especially if we're able to corroborate it in quite striking detail, then that gives us good reason to trust the portion of it that we can't independently verify. So I talk about how I think this principle is implicitly used in all sorts of areas of life. So just to give one example, so police investigating a crime, if they can corroborate a portion of a witness's testimony in detail, especially if they can, you know, corroborate it in quite striking detail, that gives them good reason to have a high estimate of the trustworthiness of the remaining portion of the witness's testimony that they can't corroborate. So the reason this is relevant is that, as I said earlier, a lot of these cases, a lot of these NDEs will have a sort of portion where the person appears to be witnessing events in this world, as it were, but then also an otherworldly portion, if you like, where they seem to encounter deceased loved ones, sometimes a being of light, and various other things. And so my thought is that insofar as we've been able to corroborate this worldly portion of the NDE, that gives us some reason to think that the otherworldly portion is also tracking objective reality. And so that gives us some reason to think that the heavenly realms that are encountered in these experiences are actually real.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so I can see that. So just to clarify, when you talk about portions, are there NDEs that are corroborated and recorded where part of the same person's same NDE was something that can be corroborated, such as shoes on roofs and workstations, but then they kind of went beyond that into some heavenly, or
a lot of them, I would say. I mean, I don't have statistics on that, but a good number of the cases I've read have both elements, the sort of terrestrial or this worldly and the otherworldly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that seems to be pretty strong then. I mean, because presumably the weaker version, but would be the case as well, is just that once you accept that there is some form of veridical perception paranormal perception going on in cases of NDE with cardiac arrest patients 1 through 100 that can be corroborated to the physical world, then similar NDEs from patients 101 to 200 that only experience some kind of heavenly realm, right, whatever, even though they may not have parts of their NDE that was, it still gives you reason to think the kind of thing that people experience in such cases can be veridical.
I would, yes, that's very well put, and I would agree with that way of putting it. And then the other aspect to it is that there is a striking degree of commonality in terms of the things that the heavenly part of the experience involves. And actually, I should say there is occasionally even an aspect of the heavenly bit that you could see as being able to be corroborated. So that's these cases where the person having the NDE encounters a deceased loved one who they didn't think should be there because they didn't realize they had died, but in fact they had just died very recently. So but yeah, some of the common themes in the otherworldly portion of these NDEs would include things like, quite famously, the tunnel with light at the end, encountering a being of light who seems to be a personal being in some sense, a life review where people will kind of witness everything they did in their lives, and there's some sense that they're kind of able to see the impact that their actions had on people. As I said, deceased loved ones, other types of spiritual beings. So these themes are pretty strongly consistent, even across cultures. Although there are some slight cultural variations. So apparently the tunnel thing is more common in Western NDEs than non-Western, but otherwise it does look like it's pretty consistent.
I hope you're enjoying the discussion so far. Our conversation continued for another 30 minutes, and that can be seen in the extended version of the episode, but this is only available to YouTube members. You can become a member from only $3 a month to watch extended episodes and get access to lots of other exclusive video content. It also really helps to support the channel and the work I do so I can do more of it. To become a member, click the link in the description or the join button, and thank you.